This is David Harvey, and you're listening to the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a podcast that looks at capitalism through a Marxist lens. This podcast is made possible by Democracy at Work. I wanted to add to the broadcast I did previously about carbon dioxide emissions and the like by thinking about some of the other environmental issues that we have to confront, and have to confront them as a matter of some emergency. I am sitting here with a paper cup in which I put my water. If you had seen former podcasts and you'd seen this, you would have seen that I had a plastic bottle with water in it. And so I want to talk a little bit about plastics, because there's been a bit of a flurry of interest in plastic problems. Plastics came on the scene in 1950. Before that, no plastics. In 1973, they finally came up with a way of making plastic which could contain carbonated waters. Before that, they weren't strong enough. And since then, bottled water has become a very significant part of our supply, to the point where in most of the United States now, people drink more bottled water than they drink tap water. Now, in some parts of the country, that's, of course, totally justifiable. If you live in Flint, Michigan, the water supply is contaminated with lead, and so lead poisoning is a real problem. So obviously, you don't drink the tap water. I live in New York City, and New York City water is extremely safe. Yet many people I know in New York City only drink bottled water because for some reason or other they fear that the public supply is in some way contaminated, which it is not. So plastics. In 1973, as I said, bottled water or bottled carbonated water became a possibility. And so since then, the consumption of plastics has accelerated. Now, plastics come out of the oil industry. Oil is the basis of plastic making. The plastics industry has expanded very dramatically. And since 1950, the data is something like 8,400 million tons of plastic have been produced globally. Now, that's a sort of astronomical figure, and I don't know how to go to it, but it's a lot of it, and a lot has increased dramatically again over the last 20 years or so. Now, the problem is that only about 20% of the plastic has been recycled. And it's difficult to recycle all of the plastics. Some of them can be easily done so, but most of them are difficult to recycle. So actually, we've got 80% of that vast amount of plastic, which actually exists in the waste stream, because plastics biodegrade at a very, very slow rate. And so waiting for them to biodegrade takes, a long time, 50 years or something of that kind. So what we have now is a vast amount, absolute amount of plastic. So what we have in this over the last 10, 15 years is a rate of increase of plastic use, which has been about 8% per year, which is compounding on a very large amount that's already there, which means that the amount of plastic is mounting up. Now, up until recently, we didn't notice this too much in the advanced capitalist countries for one very simple reason. That plastic waste was exported. It was exported to emerging markets because emerging markets needed the foreign exchange. So a large part of plastic waste was sent to China, for example. So China was absorbing plastic waste at a very strong rate at the same time as it was increasing its production of plastics and utilization of plastics in China. So you can get bottled water in China, and in large urban areas, you would drink bottled water all of the time. So the plastics industry then is expanding in places like China, but also the plastic waste stream was largely being imported from North America and from Europe, and many countries were taking it because they got a certain amount of foreign currency from doing so. But about 2 years ago, China suddenly decided it wasn't going to take it anymore. It's one of the transformations of the sort that's going on in China as China becomes a much more developed and fast-growing capitalistic kind of country. So China doesn't take it anymore, which means that we are actually faced ourselves with disposal of our own plastics. And now we're kind of looking at it and saying, well, there's an awful lot of plastic to be, to be disposed of. Now, the result is that there are mountains of plastic waste, sort of just in waste fills, and nobody knows exactly what to do with them. And a lot of it, of course, ends up in oceans and the like. And suddenly we find that there's something called the Pacific Gyre, which is a large area of the northern Pacific where there's a kind of circular motion of the currents, and things, once they get into that gyre, can't get out. And if you go to that Pacific Gyre, you'll find that it's full of plastic waste, plastic bags and the like. And this gets into the food stream. So there was an example recently of a whale which the Japanese caught, and they opened it, and it had about, a ton of plastics in its stomach. So seabirds and the like suddenly found to have large quantities of plastic in them. So the plastic is getting into the waste stream, and it's getting into. So you go to beaches, and you'll find large quantity of plastic waste on beaches, and so people go in and do cleanup of the beaches, and sort of tons and tons and tons of plastic. So what are we going to do about plastic? Well, here too we're looking at the question of why has there been this massive increase in plastic? Well, of course, it's a convenient way to absorb the capacity of capital accumulation. And so the plastics industry has become a very important source of profitability. And plastics industry goes out of its way to try to find uses for plastics which haven't been there before. And I mentioned the bottled water. Well, one of the things the plastic industry does is to advertise and to make sure that you understand that a lot of sources of public water are unsafe to drink. Now, to be honest, if I'm in Mexico, out of respect for what we call Montezuma's revenge, I generally drink bottled water because the water supply, potable water supply, is not adequate. If I'm in Flint, Michigan, I'm going to drink bottled water because of the lead toxins which are in the public water supply. So one of the answers to the use of plastics is to make absolutely sure that water supplies are potable and that the public source of water is one which absolutely becomes possible to utilize without fear of disease. So, but there is not that much interest in doing that. All of the time, the bottled water is one of the alternatives which we have. The other ways in which plastic becomes sort of a part of daily use, and there's been a kind of lot of discussion about this now, are plastic bags which are always given at the grocery store. And in some countries, like Ireland, they've been banned. There's talk of banning them or charging for them in New York City, and this does have some impact on the use of public bags. Plastic uses in terms of the urban food supply have become very significant. Everything gets encased in plastic, and that's part of the way in which the security of the food supply is assured. But there are some aspects of this which are unnecessary. For example, if you go into a supermarket and you find there's one table where there's loose mushrooms which you can put into a very very small plastic bag, or you can take a plastic container of pre-packed mushrooms. And if we all got used to saying, okay, we're going to take the loose mushrooms rather than the plastic container mushrooms, then I think we would again be able to reduce our plastic consumption. The other thing we find is you go into a place and you ask for just ordinary water, then people give you water and some ice in it, and they give you a plastic straw. Plastic straws are absolutely lethal when they get out into the food chain. Plastic straws are all over the place on beaches and everywhere. So we could reduce plastic straws simply by changing cultural kind of things. But notice something here. What this means is that the consumer side of plastics has to shrink. And if the consumer side shrinks, then there is no possibility for further capital accumulation by expanding plastic uses, which raises the kind of interesting question, can we actually eliminate plastics from what we have? And the answer to that is we can't do so. I mean, plastics have become now part of our lifestyle in very, very crucial ways. If you look at medical equipment, for example, and things like catheters and the tubes through which IVs are sent and all the rest of it, we have an absolute use for plastics, so they are a necessity in certain areas. But we ought to be able to distinguish in terms of our use of plastics between what is necessary and what is absolutely unnecessary and can therefore be discarded. But then that also requires a public to get a sophisticated taste, so that when somebody comes along and says, look, we should stop using plastic bags for our groceries, and we should take a canvas bag we have at home or something like that to pick up our groceries. If we do that, then we'll be in a different world. But again, notice that the dynamics of capital accumulation point in the other direction. The dynamic of capital accumulation are going to absolutely resist any drop-off in plastic production and plastic utilization because this is a major source of profitability and a major source of capital accumulation. But this goes back to all forms of waste which now exist. And it's been put to my attention that actually we should start to think more clearly about how these forms of waste and wasteful utilization of existing resources is actually built into ways of life. For instance, I was looking at a piece the other day which argued that the meat base of a lot of our present consumption was something that came into being after 1945, and it had a lot to do with the fact that there was not a shortage of grain production. There was an excess. There was a food surplus around which needed to be utilized in some way. And one of the best ways to use the grain surplus was to feed it to cattle and pigs and chickens and all the rest of it, which was a very inefficient way of converting calories which are there in the food in the food grain into calories which are in the meat products. In other words, there's a huge loss of calories by moving to a meat diet. And the meat diet, of course, then is based on cattle rearing and the like, which also has implications for what I was talking about in the last podcast, which is the greenhouse gas emissions, because cattle are a source of methane. This is something that was joked about a lot when this idea of the Green New Deal was proposed, and it was pointed out that methane emissions from cattle would, if we moved to a different kind of diet in which we were less dependent upon beef, we would actually reduce methane gas emissions. And everybody, Mitch McConnell came out and said, "Oh, these people, they're concerned with cow farts and cow belches and this kind of thing, and there was a ho, ho, ho kind of reception. But actually, if you look at the concentration of methane in the atmosphere, and I've seen some sort of maps of this, you'll see a big cloud of methane over the American Midwest, and you'll see a big cloud of methane over Argentina and southern Brazil and in some other areas of the world, and that methane is entirely due to the very large cattle herds that are housed there. Now, it turns out that actually there are means of raising cattle which capture the methane. And if we're talking about dairy production, if the cattle are indoors, then you can capture the methane by various devices in the cattle sheds, which means, of course, then people kind of get very angry about the fact that the cattle never see the light of day. They can't get out there and mooch around on the grass and all this kind of thing. But on the other hand, what this does is to mean that the methane gas can be captured and it can be utilized as a source of energy. And there are some cattle rearing farms now which are energy independent because they simply recycle the methane gas into the production of energy, so they have their own electric systems based upon that. So there are ways of dealing with this, but what happens is that as countries become more sort of addicted to meat-based diets, and we see this in countries like Nigeria that move from a vegetable base to a meat base, and this is seen as a sign of development and a sign of everything. Then we get a different kind of impact upon the environment. Now, my point here is this, that there are many things going on in the environmental area that need to be addressed. I suggested that the climate change thing is now very, very serious. I think something like the levels of plastic utilization are getting to the point of being very serious, because in the plastics case, there is something else going on, which says that the biodegradation of plastics has a very particular kind of mode. That is, under sunlight, plastics do degrade, but they degrade into plastic microparticles. That is, almost invisible particles of plastic which exist. And they were only discovered as being there in around 2004, a whole series of papers. So over the last 15 years or so, people have become aware of the concentration of microplastic waste. So this was discovered in a very interesting way, that people went to the beaches and started to clear up the plastics off the beaches, and they got the solid plastics off the beaches and said, okay, the beaches are clean. And then somebody took some parts of the sand on the beaches and started to extract from it to see what else was in the sand, and it turned out these microplastic particles were heavily concentrated in the sands. And these microplastic particles can be found in our food supply in all sorts of ways. And nobody knows to this day exactly what the microplastic particles are doing in terms of our health, in terms of our ingestion, in terms of what it is present in our own food supply. So the question of microplastics is becoming very significant again. So we've got to be careful about use. So now on this, I'm not going to be kind of apocalyptic and say we're all going to die of microplastic poisoning in 5 years unless we do something. But I am going to say that microplastics is a problem. We need to have a very serious analysis of it. We need to look very carefully at the plastics industry in general. As I've said, it's oil-based, and it's part of what the energy companies are going to push upon us. We have a general idea that plastics are good, that they're important, and indeed they are for certain functions. They are omnipresent in things we utilize, and therefore we cannot imagine a world right now which would be plastics free. But we can certainly imagine a world where we are much more cautious in how we are utilizing plastics. Think about those uses which are significant and important and justifiable. Think about those which are unjustifiable. Think about those sorts of questions. And this is a more sort of simple approach to the environmental problem than I think is called for in the case of climate change. But when we look at the level of plastic use, the vast amount of plastic waste which is already there and which needs to be sort of monitored and cared for, and then we think about the rate of expansion of plastic use of 8% per year on a compound basis on a massive amount that's already there. This is something that needs to be curbed. But in order to curb it, we have to recognize that we're actually then curbing a very dynamic sector of the economy where we've got a very important source of capital accumulation and circulation. And that here, too, there are reasons to be skeptical of the way in which capital is going to be able to approach the plastic waste problem. And there are also some aspects of plastics production which need to be taken care of. For example, I mentioned that recycling is very difficult with the plastics. Only about 20% of plastics get recycled. Part of that has to do with the way in which plastics are produced and the form that plastics takes. For example, plastic water bottles, if they are clear and if they are not, in other words, are of normal sort, can be recycled. And that therefore these are less of a problem than those forms of plastics where the bottles are colored, the bottles are shaped in a different kind of way. So one of the things we could do is to start to regulate plastics production, to say you should concentrate plastic production on those forms of plastics which can be easily recycled, and you should abandon those forms of plastics production which cannot be recycled or are very difficult to recycle. Because right now, in most cities like New York City, there's a particular basin in which we put all of our plastics, and we imagine that all of it's going to be recycled. In fact, very little of it gets recycled. About 80% of what we put in there ends up in plastic waste dumps, which used to be in China, but which now are increasingly in our own backyards. So there are many things that can be done on the environmental question, but in each case, we run up against the fact that the plastics industry is a very effective industry. It's going to agitate against the banning of plastic bags. It's going to agitate against the banning of plastic straws. It's going to agitate against the banning of plastic drinking cups and all the rest of it. So I think that we have to recognize here too, the part of the problem in the background is the necessity to expand the dynamics of capital accumulation, the necessity to increase the profitability of the plastics industry and the oil industry, and we're going to find ourselves embattled once again against the forces of capital accumulation which lie behind these environmental questions. These environmental questions can, at this point, have, I think, a very serious quantitative problem. And like I say, with the plastics industry, 20, 30 years ago, there was not a problem there. It now is a serious problem. 20 or 30 years ago, we could have said about climate change and CO2 emissions and all the rest of it that, okay, it was maybe manageable. In both of these questions, this is no longer manageable. There has to be some dramatic improvement in the way in which we're using our environmental aggregates. And this is why I think any environmentalist, serious environmentalist, has to be an anti-capitalist, because you cannot get rid of the force behind these transformations without grappling with the dynamics of capital accumulation and the way in which capitalism operates as an economic, social, and political system. Thank you for joining me today. You've been listening to David Harvey's Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a Democracy at Work production. A special thank you to the wonderful Patreon community for supporting this project.